A woman calls 911 because she can no longer use my land as a shortcut. This led to a conflict with my neighbors and the HOA. Let me tell you from the beginning how this drama unfolded. When I moved here, I never thought my own land would become a shortcut for strangers. At first, I found it odd but not necessarily alarming. Maybe it was an old habit that would slowly fade away. But after a few months, I started noticing strange things. At first, it was just a few tire tracks on the narrow path running alongside my property. I thought it might have been a random mistake, but that quickly changed. Before I knew it, I was regularly seeing cars passing through as if my private property was a public road. At first, I was mostly surprised. How could people be so careless about someone else's land? But my surprise quickly turned into frustration. I tried to wave at the drivers or signal to them that they weren't allowed to be there, but most completely ignored me. Some even gave me irritated looks, as if I was the one in the wrong. It became a daily annoyance, and I started checking more often to see if there were new tracks in the sand. One morning, I looked out my window and saw something shocking: a line of cars slowly driving across my path. This was no longer an occasional incident. It had become a structural problem. People from the HOA neighborhood were using my land as their personal shortcut, without any regard for the fact that they were on private property. The damage wasn't limited to just tire tracks. One day I found trash near the path: coffee cups, candy wrappers, and even a broken umbrella. Apparently, these people didn't just see my land as a shortcut, but also as a dumping ground. It felt like I was gradually losing control over my own property. Then one morning, I came home to find that a car had taken the turn too wide and had left deep ruts in my grass. That was the last straw. This was no longer just carelessness. It was outright disregard for my property. I couldn't sit back and do nothing anymore. Something had to be done. I contacted the HOA, thinking they would take the side of homeowners. To my surprise, they told me there was nothing they could do because my property was outside their jurisdiction. That was the moment I realized I had to take matters into my own hands. My frustration turned into determination. I knew I had to find a way to stop these trespassers, and if the HOA wasn't going to help me, I would do it myself. But I had no idea how much this conflict was about to escalate. I wasn't going to sit back and watch my property be treated like a public road any longer. If no one else was going to put a stop to this, then I had to do it myself. The first step? Research. I needed to know my rights and make sure whatever I did was completely legal. The last thing I wanted was to give the HOA or my entitled neighbors an excuse to fight back. I spent hours reading up on property laws, easements, and HOA restrictions. The more I learned, the more confident I became. My land was private, and there was absolutely no legal requirement for me to allow people to use it as a shortcut. That was all the confirmation I needed. I had every right to block access, and I was going to do just that. I started by putting up no trespassing signs along the path. I figured a few well-placed warnings might be enough to deter people, but I was wrong. The next morning, I found one of the signs ripped from the post and tossed into the grass. That was when I knew simple signs weren't going to cut it. I needed something stronger. So I made the decision to build a fence and install a locked gate. If they couldn't respect a sign, then they would have to respect a physical barrier. I hired a contractor, and within days, the construction began. Watching that fence go up was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Finally, I was reclaiming my property. Of course, the neighborhood didn't take kindly to it. The day the fence was completed, I noticed several HOA members lingering near my property line, whispering amongst themselves and shooting me dirty looks. I even overheard one of them say, "He can't just do this." But the truth was, I could, and I did. It didn't take long for the complaints to start rolling in. The HOA sent me a letter claiming my fence was disruptive to the community. Some neighbors even confronted me directly, arguing that I was being selfish by closing off access. But I wasn't about to back down. This was my land, and I wasn't going to be bullied into opening it up just because it was convenient for them. Then, just when I thought the worst was over, the real trouble began. One morning, I heard an angry car horn blaring outside. I stepped out onto my porch, and sure enough, there was a furious woman standing by my new gate, arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. That was the first time I met Karen. Karen was exactly the kind of person I had expected to show up eventually. Entitled, furious, and convinced that the world revolved around her. The moment she saw me step outside, she marched straight toward my gate, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You need to open this gate," she snapped. "I'm already late." I raised an eyebrow. Late for what? Trespassing? Because that's not my problem. She huffed, crossing her arms. "This has always been an access road. You can't just block it off. I'm on the HOA board, and we have been using this for years." Ah, there it was. The HOA power trip. I had read enough about these situations to know exactly what was happening. Karen thought that because she was part of the HOA, she had some kind of authority over my land. "Karen, this is my property," I said firmly. "The HOA has no jurisdiction here. You and your neighbors have been trespassing for months, and I'm done with it. The gate stays." Her face turned bright red. "You'll regret this. The HOA will take action against you," she shrieked, pulling out her phone. I wasn't intimidated. "Go ahead and call whoever you want, but this gate isn't going anywhere." She glared at me for a long moment before stomping back to her car. But just as I thought she was leaving, she stopped, turned around, and smirked. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she sneered. "The entire community is behind me on this. You think you can fight all of us?" I folded my arms, keeping my voice steady. "I don't need to fight anyone. I just need to enforce my property rights." She let out an exaggerated sigh and put her phone to her ear. "Yes, hello. I need the police. Someone is illegally blocking access to a community road," she said dramatically. I couldn't help but chuckle. "Good luck with that," I muttered under my breath. Moments later, she snapped a few photos of my fence and gate, mumbling something about legal action before finally driving off. I watched her car disappear down the road, knowing full well this wasn't the end of it. Karen wasn't just entitled, she was determined, and something told me she wasn't going to let this go anytime soon. I had a feeling this wasn't over, but I was more than ready for whatever she had planned next. Karen stood by the gate, phone pressed to her ear, glaring at me with pure indignation. I could hear snippets of her conversation. "Yes, officer, he put up a gate blocking our community road. No, he won't open it. Yes, I need someone here now." I leaned against my porch railing, waiting. I wasn't worried. I knew the law was on my side. Still, the thought of having to explain this to the police annoyed me. This was a waste of everyone's time. Karen kept glancing at me, smirking like she had already won. 15 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up. 2 officers stepped out, one of them approaching me while the other went to Karen. "We got a report of someone blocking a public road," the officer said, glancing at my fence. "It's not a public road," I replied calmly. "It's private property. Here's my deed and a map showing the property lines." I handed him the documents I had prepared, knowing this moment would come. The officer looked them over, nodded, and walked back to his partner. Karen was still talking animatedly, waving her hands. But as soon as the officers compared notes, her expression started to shift. One officer turned to her. "Ma'am, this is private property. The owner has the right to restrict access. There's nothing we can do." Karen's jaw dropped. But we've used it for years. He can't just do this." "Actually, he can," the officer said. "Unless you can show proof of an easement, he has every right to block access." Karen's face turned beet red. She opened her mouth to argue, but the officers had already made their decision. She muttered something under her breath, then stormed back to her car. Before she left, she rolled down her window and shouted, "This isn't over!" As the officers prepared to leave, one of them turned to me. "Sorry for the trouble. We get a lot of these HOA disputes. You handled it well." I nodded. "Thanks, officer. I appreciate it." Karen's car lingered at the end of the street for a moment before she finally sped off. I let out a long breath, feeling a temporary sense of relief. The police had sided with me, and Karen had no choice but to back down. But I knew Karen. She wasn't going to give up that easily. If she couldn't win with the police, she'd find another way to escalate things. This battle was over, but the war was far from finished. I thought the police shutting Karen down would be the end of it, but I should have known better. Within days, I received a formal letter from the HOA demanding I remove the fence immediately. They claimed it was damaging the aesthetics of the neighborhood and that it was negatively impacting community access. I nearly laughed at the absurdity. I drafted a polite but firm response explaining that my fence was legally installed on my own property and that the HOA had no jurisdiction over it. I attached copies of my deed, property survey, and even the local zoning laws proving I was in the right. I sent the letter and waited. A week later, I received another letter, this time more aggressive. They threatened legal action, fines, and even a potential lawsuit if I didn't comply. I wasn't intimidated. I had done my research, and I knew they didn't have a legal leg to stand on. Then Karen escalated things further. One evening, I checked my security cameras and saw her standing by my fence, pointing at it while talking to another HOA member. The next morning, I found a note taped to my gate. "Remove this fence or the HOA will take action. Last warning." I decided to keep my cool, but I knew this was only going to get worse. Later that week, I overheard a conversation between two neighbors discussing the HOA's latest meeting. Karen had reportedly spent an entire hour complaining about my fence, insisting that it was an obstruction that needed to be removed immediately. Some members agreed with her, but others were starting to question whether they even had the power to enforce anything on private property. A few days later, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked near my property. A man in a suit stepped out, clipboard in hand, and started taking photos of my fence. I approached him and asked what he was doing. He introduced himself as an HOA compliance officer, claiming he was conducting an inspection. "This isn't HOA property," I told him plainly. "You have no right to inspect anything here." He hesitated, then mumbled something about HOA policies before quickly leaving. It was clear they were grasping at straws. That night, I sat on my porch watching the street. I knew Karen wouldn't give up easily, but neither would I. If they wanted a legal battle, I was more than ready. The war had officially begun. I knew the HOA wouldn't give up easily, but I was prepared for whatever they threw at me. A few days after the so-called inspection, I received an official notice demanding I attend the next HOA board meeting. They claimed my fence violated neighborhood policies and that further action would be taken if I failed to comply. I wasn't about to let them intimidate me. On the night of the meeting, I walked into the HOA's office with a folder full of legal documents. The room was packed with board members and a few concerned neighbors, some supportive, others clearly siding with Karen. I spotted her right away, sitting at the head of the table, arms crossed, a smug expression on her face. The HOA president started the meeting by outlining the issues caused by my fence. "Several residents have voiced concerns about the restricted access caused by this structure," he said. "We believe it is in the best interest of the community that it be removed." I stood up, taking a deep breath. "With all due respect, this is my private property," I said, placing my documents on the table. "I have the legal right to put up a fence, and the HOA has no authority over land outside its jurisdiction. Here's proof from the county records." I slid copies of my deed, property maps, and zoning laws across the table. The president hesitated as he flipped through them, while Karen scoffed. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "We've been using that shortcut for years. You can't just decide to block it." "Actually, I can," I replied, "and unless you have legal proof stating otherwise, there's nothing the HOA can do." A few board members exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, an older man, cleared his throat. "He's right," he admitted. "We don't have jurisdiction over private land. We can't force him to remove the fence." Karen's face turned red. "But we have to do something," she nearly shouted. "No, we don't," the president said, setting my documents aside. "This matter is closed. The HOA has no claim here." Karen slammed her fist on the table. "You're making a mistake. He's setting a dangerous precedent. If we let this happen, we'll lose control." That was the turning point. The mood in the room changed, and slowly but surely, Karen lost control. That was the turning point. The mood in the room shifted, and slowly but surely, Karen lost control. "Or," I said, "you could respect property boundaries like any reasonable organization." A few board members chuckled under their breath. Karen looked around, realizing she had lost her support. Her face twisted in frustration before she stormed out of the room. The president sighed. "This meeting is adjourned." As I walked out, a few neighbors gave me nods of approval. I had won. The fence would stay, and for the first time in months, I finally felt like my property was truly mine again. Just when I thought the ordeal was over, Karen proved me wrong. Losing the HOA battle wasn't enough for her. She was determined to win, no matter what. Within a week, I received a letter from her lawyer claiming that my fence was an unlawful obstruction and that legal action would be pursued if I didn't take it down immediately. I shook my head, almost laughing at the desperation. I knew my rights and I knew my fence was fully legal. Still, I wasn't about to take any chances. I immediately contacted my own lawyer, who assured me that Karen had no case. If she wanted to take me to court, she would lose badly. Days passed and I kept expecting some kind of escalation. Sure enough, one morning, I caught Karen standing at my gate, speaking animatedly to a group of neighbors. I stepped outside, ready for another confrontation. "You're ruining this neighborhood," she shouted as soon as she saw me. "Everyone hates that stupid fence." I crossed my arms. "It's my property, Karen. You don't have to like it, but you do have to respect it." One of the neighbors, an older woman, cleared her throat. "Karen, maybe it's time to move on. He's made it clear he's not backing down." Karen shot her a glare. "You don't understand. If we let him get away with this, who knows what's next?" "You mean people respecting private property?" I said. "Because I think that's a good precedent to set." Murmurs spread through the group. Karen's control was slipping, and she knew it. Her face twisted in frustration, but she had nothing left to argue. One by one, the neighbors walked away, leaving her standing there, seething. That evening, I received an email from the HOA. They officially distanced themselves from Karen's actions, stating that they would not support any further legal pursuits against me. It was over. Karen, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. She left one last voicemail, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won? This isn't over. You'll regret this." But I had won. My fence was staying, my property was mine, and Karen's reign of entitlement was coming to an end. For the first time in a long while, I felt peace. Karen wasn't done, but she had underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect my property. After her failed legal threats, I decided to take matters a step further. I went public with the story. I reached out to a local news station, providing them with details of the HOA's overreach, the police intervention, and the repeated harassment I had faced. The story gained traction quickly, and within days, a reporter came to interview me right in front of my now famous gate. When the segment aired, it painted a clear picture: a homeowner defending their rights against an overbearing HOA and an entitled board member who refused to accept the law. The public reaction was overwhelming. Comments flooded social media, with people calling out Karen's behavior and sharing their own HOA horror stories. Karen, of course, was furious. The HOA board received a flood of complaints, and some members started distancing themselves from her. The negative publicity was damaging, and soon enough, Karen's name became synonymous with overreach and entitlement. Even some of my neighbors who had initially sided with her began to realize how ridiculous the whole situation had become. Things escalated when a major news outlet picked up the story. They highlighted how homeowners across the country were facing similar battles with HOAs. I even received messages from strangers thanking me for standing my ground and exposing the issue. The final blow came when an HOA board meeting was recorded and leaked online. Karen was caught ranting about how people like me were ruining the neighborhood, and she even suggested implementing new rules to control homeowners who didn't comply. The backlash was immediate. The board received pressure from all sides, and within a week, Karen was forced to step down. One evening, I received an email from the HOA president. It was short and to the point. "The board has voted to drop any action against you. We apologize for any inconvenience this has caused. The matter is officially closed." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was over. The battle that had consumed months of my life had finally ended, and the public had been on my side. Karen had been exposed, the HOA had backed down, and my property was mine once and for all. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. With Karen removed from the HOA board and the case against me dropped, I finally felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The battle had been exhausting, but it was worth every second. My fence remained standing, my property was respected, and best of all, the harassment had stopped. Over the next few weeks, things slowly returned to normal. Neighbors who had once glared at me now nodded politely when passing by. A few even admitted they never really cared about the shortcut but had been pressured by Karen's aggressive tactics. The silence on my property was proof enough that I had done the right thing. Not long after, I received a final letter from the HOA. This time, instead of threats, it was a formal apology. They acknowledged that they had overstepped their bounds and assured me that no further action would be taken against me. It was a small victory, but an important one. Karen, on the other hand, had disappeared from the neighborhood spotlight. I heard she had resigned from the board entirely and was keeping a low profile. The once vocal and demanding figure had been silenced by her own actions. No more threats, no more letters, just peace and quiet. One evening, as I stood by my gate, looking at the peaceful stretch of land that was finally mine again, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had been a fight I never asked for, but one I refused to back down from. And the lesson? Always stand up for your rights, because sometimes it's the only way to protect your property.